Welcome and joining me, Gregoire Theron, Chief Investment Officer at GraySwan's, for our June market overview. I thought today we'll speak about currencies. The big question we have from our investors is when's a good time to buy pounds, to buy euros, to buy US dollars? So the first thing we look at today is just to ask ourselves, at what point in time in history will we be able to buy pounds sterling, buy euros or US dollars at current valuations? And if you look at the rand versus the pound, the last time the rand was this strong was back roughly 7.5 years ago. And if you look at the red line, which is euros, almost 5.5 years ago. And if you look at the US dollar, also roughly 5.5 years ago. So today you could buy dollars, euro or pounds at levels you haven't experienced in roughly 5 years ago. Next, we look at valuations, and we always look at valuations, whether it's equity market valuations or bond valuations. And in terms of currency, the rand US dollar exchange rate, the one valuation metric you could look at is PPP. It's the purchasing power parity analysis. This is done by Prudential, and the red line shows you the movement of the rand dollar exchange rate over time, and the dark gray line shows you the fair value of the rand. Currently, the rand's trading close to its fair value. It's important to also note that the rand do go through periods where it stays strong or stays very weak for longer periods than you would think. But again, it's about entry points here. When's a good time to start taking money abroad? Next, we look at market conditions globally. Why is this important? Because the more aggressively investors are positioned, the more aggressive assets they're buying, such as emerging market currencies or also the rand. When investors are fearful, they sell out of aggressive assets, they invest more cautiously, and they don't buy emerging market currencies such as the rand. So if you go back to the 2008 financial crisis, here we look at the JP Morgan Fear Complacency Indicator, which is the dark blue line. And during that 2008 financial crisis, you can see fear in the markets was at all-time peaks. And at that point in time, the global world equity markets, based on the price to earnings valuation, was very cheap. And what it shows you is that when there's a lot of fear in the markets, assets are typically priced cheaply. But when there's a lot of complacency in the equity markets, investors are taking on a lot of risk and assets are priced quite expensively. And where are we priced currently? Well, if you look at the JP Morgan Fear Complacency Indicator, which is the dark blue line, investors have not been this complacent in the last 20 years. It means that investors are very aggressively positioned. And if you look at assets in terms of the world equity markets, the price to earnings valuation, world equities currently are priced at levels we last experienced prior to the 2000 tech bubble. And therefore, it shows us that investors are very aggressively positioned. The risk here is that when this turns around and investors becomes fearful, they sell out of aggressive assets such as the rand. Next, we look at the quality spread. And what is the quality spread? The quality spread is just the yield or the interest you receive, or the difference in interest you receive when buying US government bonds versus when you buy US corporate bonds issued by companies basically in the US. And that spread shows you the quality spread. We also look at the US government 10-year bond yield versus the European high yield bond yields. And historically, what we've seen is that when this quality spread is at all-time lows, we start seeing the rand dollar exchange rate, which is in dark gray, start to weaken. If you look back at 2017, again, there we experienced quality spreads being very low. You saw the rand actually weakening from that point in time. And the question is, where are we today? Well, if you ask yourself today, how are investors positioned? We know that they position very aggressively. We can see that through the quality spread as well. And typically at these points in time, when investors are this aggressive, the rand tends to start weakening again. We also look at quantitative factors, and this is just a simple analysis where we look at the rand dollar exchange rate over 12-month rolling periods. And what does the graph show you? It shows you that during the 2000 tech bubble, the rand depreciated by 60% relative to the dollar during that sell-off in global equity markets. During the 2008 financial crisis, the rand sold off by 50% over the 12-month rolling basis. And during the pandemic of last year, the rand sold off roughly 30% over a 12-month rolling basis. What we do look at is in points in time where market starts to recover and investors do invest aggressively back into the markets, and we do see the strengthening of the currency. And we experienced this after the 2000 tech bubble, again after the 2008 financial crisis. And we've just experienced again this massive strengthening of the currency. The red line just shows you that the 2 standard deviation strengthening or weakening of the currency. And currently where we are, you can see that the rand has strengthened by 2 standard deviations over the last 12-month rolling period. Next, we look at liquidity in the market. What drives liquidity? Well, liquidity is driven by the amount of dollars being printed or money being printed globally. This graph shows you during the 2008 financial crisis, during quantitative easing 1, 2, and 3, when the Fed basically printed money. And again, looking back to last year, we experienced the biggest amount of money or stimulus being printed in history. And it just shows you at these points in time, a lot of dollars being printed specifically, and that causes a lot of liquidity coming into the markets. So how does this affect the US dollar? And why is that important? Well, the US dollar and the movement of the US dollar is very important, as that drives or affects emerging market currencies and the rand. When the dollar strengthens substantially, the rand tends to weaken. And where are we today? Well, we need to look back at what happened historically during periods of time when central banks printed a lot of money. So if you go back to the 2008 financial crisis during quantitative easing 1, 2, and 3, and the blue line shows you the DXY. It's a trade-weighted US dollar index relative to major currencies globally. And as the US Fed printed a lot of money, you saw the US dollar weakening dramatically. But as the stimulus started pulling back and as quantitative easing stopped, we started seeing the dollar strengthening again. During the cycles, it happened again. It happened during last year, where the Fed printed the most amount of money in history. And the rand was trading above 19 rand to the dollar at that stage. And today, we're trading at roughly 13 rand 60. So again, the stimulus or this printing of money affects currencies, it affects the strength or the weakness of the dollar, and affects the way the rand would move. Now we have to ask ourselves, well, where are we today and what's going to happen going forward? Well, the next slide is a slide by Nedbank, and it shows you the US dollar liquidity index in green versus the DXY, the US dollar trade weighted index, inverted. And the key to the slide is just to see that during the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, when the Fed printed a lot of dollars and there was a lot of liquidity in the markets, dollar liquidity in the markets, we experienced this period where the dollar strength weakened quite dramatically. And what's going to happen going forward? Well, we can already see in the green line that this US dollar liquidity is starting to roll off. And we know that in the future, that the US Fed has to start tapering. They have to start pulling this liquidity back, not only them, the ECB as well. So we're going to go into this phase where we're going to see less liquidity in the markets. And typically, during these periods of time, we do see the dollar strengthening, and that could be very negative for the rand. We also look at yield differentials, and what do I mean with that? We just look at the difference in the yield you're getting when you buy US 10-year government treasuries or bonds versus the yield or the interest you're receiving when you're buying other developed market and 10-year government bonds, excluding the US. And the graph at the bottom shows you the yield differential. So it shows you that during 2000, the US 10-year government bonds were paying roughly 2% more than what other developed markets 10-year government bonds were paying. At the top, we indicate the US dollar. And what you can see that during these periods where yield differentials are high, then the dollar typically strengthens. And when yield differentials compresses, we do see this period where the dollar weakens. And simplistically, it's the supply-demand factor of it, because if you're sitting in Europe and you're getting negative yields on your European government bonds, then what are you going to do? Well, you're going to sell your euros, you're going to buy dollars, so there's demand for dollars, they're going to buy US government bonds. And therefore, as the demand for dollars picks up, the dollar tends to strengthen. Where are we today? Well, again, what we're seeing is that this yield spread between the US and other international developed market bonds are increasing again, and that could be positive for the US dollar. Last, we look at just some forecasting. This is a forecast done by Standard Bank. It was published on the 7th of June. Rand was trading at roughly 13 Rand 50 to the dollar at that point in time. And their view over the next year and 2 years is that the Rand do start weakening again. So 2020 view is that the Rand trades at 14 Rand 80, and 2023 Rand trades at 15 Rand 50. Same for the euro and same for the pound. Structurally, the view is that the Rand weakens from year on in. Again, you know, the Rand could strengthen over the next 3 to 6 months, depending on what happens with commodity prices. The big driver, again, would be depending on when global central bank starts tapering. But structurally, over the long term, we think that the Rand will start weakening again. And we think at current levels where the Rand's trading, we think it's a good opportunity to start buying foreign currency. Thank you for joining me, Gregoire Theron. Hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.